guests from our larger community. We're glad that you came to hear Georgette's presentation today. Hope you found the food and drink. And the way this works is she's going to speak, and then I think she's agreed to answer some questions at the end. So we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. Okay, that's the latest it'll ever go. But we'll see how it goes. So Dr. Georgette Bennett was brought to my attention as a friend of Dee Bartlett. And so in a moment, I will invite Dee to give a more personal introduction. January 27th, as some of you know, was Holocaust Remembrance Day in our country. And while we couldn't have it last Sunday, it's providential as we had a major snowstorm and didn't even meet last Sunday. So we're thankful that the snowstorm stayed in the Carolinas. We're sorry about that for the Carolinians, but it's a perfectly beautiful day. And so we're glad that you're out here. Let me just say that many people are afraid of current parallels in our country with the history of the 1930s in Germany. Christian nationalism is being used by even our elected leaders to shield the moral injury that we are experiencing on an almost daily basis. And so it is timely that we welcome Georgette, who has devoted the last 33 years of her life to interreligious relations, human rights, and conflict resolution. Her early career, I've been told, is in sociology and criminology with an interest in the links between religion and violence. And her books, her most recent, which will be available for purchase. Where's the book table? I didn't see the book table. Oh, and if you want to purchase books, Patty and Stefan over there, I think they're going to be selling for us. So we appreciate you guys doing that. Her most recent book, which is just right here, and she's going to be talking about that, I think, a little bit, will be available for purchase. And all of her work explores the various forms of violence that we do to each other. And of course, the last weeks we've seen too much of it, even on a small scale, but it's real, and I think there's much more that we even don't know about. But she also talks, and this is why we have some hope about how we can deal with that violence in healthy and hopefully peace-making ways. So Dee, thank you for making the connection, and now please give a more personal introduction of our guest.
Thank you. I am absolutely delighted to introduce to you my friend, Georgette Bennett. You are in for a rare treat. I have never met someone whose accomplishments are as stunning as Georgette's. She'll be embarrassed, so I won't go any further on that. She has spent, exactly, see embarrassment. As Scott said, she spent the last 30 plus years doing conflict resolution in various parts of the world. She is the founder of the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding and the Multi-Faith Alliance. I got to know Georgette a number of years ago when she was heading the Multi-Faith Alliance, then called for Syrian refugees. She was getting food and aid into Syria when no one else could. She is doing the same thing now in Gaza. I have no idea how she manages this, but she does. Georgette is an unlikely survivor of the Holocaust. Her mother had suffered 7 miscarriages. By the time she finally gave birth to Georgette in a bombed-out apartment in Budapest. Her mother scrounged for food, and the only baby food she could find were sardines and beer. Absolutely. She has said that the odds, quote, the odds of my having been born are practically nil, and this has left me with a lifelong feeling that I owe a debt to the world. Georgette, let me assure you, you've paid off that debt. You have. She arrived in New York City not speaking a word of English, greeted by a cousin-in-law, Gary Phillips, the subject of her latest book. Note I said latest, there are 3 predecessor books that I found, maybe more. Good, all right, I got that wrong. 8 more. All right, you get the picture. Georgette is definitely an overachiever. All right. She has written a book about Pips entitled Half Jew, Full Life, The Unlikely Journey of a Voluntary Jew from Nazi Persecution to the American Dream. Harrowing story. I finished it last night. Could not put it down for 3 days. Pips resistance, captures, 3 times, escapes, 3 times, maybe 4 times, successes and tragedies. Why is Pip important today? In these perilous times, her message of moral courage and the resilience of the human spirit could not be more timely. Georgette, thank you.
Dee Dee, I love you. I have no idea how I'm going to live up to that introduction. But I'm very, very grateful to you. I'm grateful to all of you for braving a really, really cold day. But I think you probably did it more for that guy there. Right? No? Okay. But I'm no threat. So, as Pastor Hurst said, we've just emerged from Holocaust Remembrance Day. So this seems to be a very fitting time for my visit with you. As I do my talk, you're going to be hearing Pips's voice a lot, except it's going to be my voice, which is the opposite of his voice. He had a very deep voice. But whenever I'm quoting him, I'm going to try to change my voice so you know it's him speaking. The systematic war against the Jews officially began with Kristallnacht in November 9th, 1938, a pogrom in which synagogues were torched and Jewish homes and businesses were vandalized throughout Germany. 7 years later, the war ended with 2/3 of Europe's 9.5 million Jews slaughtered and the 250,000 remaining Jews living in displaced persons camps. Among those were my 4 grandparents, most of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. Also 2 siblings who I never knew because they and their mother were shot in front of their father in the Tarnow ghetto. That father was the man who was to become my father. Had his first family not been killed, he never would have undertaken the risky trek from Poland to Hungary, where he met my mother. And I never would have come into being. Because my life was made possible only by their deaths, I feel that I have to name them. Their names are Manya, Frida, and Helena. Between the war against the Jews and, as Dee Dee mentioned, my mother's miscarriages, and as Dee Dee also mentioned, the odds of my ever having been born were practically nil. But when I was finally born in Budapest in 1946, Budapest was already a ravaged city with mass starvation. But the Nazis didn't reach Hungary until 1944, and they were already losing the war at that point. But that wasn't going to stop them from killing as many Jews as they could before they lost the war. And in less than 2 months, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, most of them to Auschwitz. And that's where my grandparents literally went up in smoke. And that's where my cousin Olga, who was one of the characters in my book, was confined. My mother and father miraculously survived concentration camp, ghettos, and forced labor. And here I am to tell not only my tale, but the tale that you've come here to hear, and that's this one. The Holocaust started as an all-out war against Jews as a race, not a religion. In fact, it was the first time that anti-Semitism was based on race rather than on religion, and it was a total fiction because Jews are not a race. In fact, there are many races among Jews. The Nazis branded Jews as traitors, demonized daily in sophisticated propaganda campaigns, and they became seen as the Antichrist, children of dark, who had to be vanquished by the children of light, the racially pure Aryans, in an apocalyptic struggle that would bring the 1,000-year Reich into existence. And the Fuhrer became the stand-in for the Messiah, intent on eliminating the satanic forces, namely Jews, who were undermining the fatherland. And as such, he meant to make Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the first step in the war on the Jews was to deprive them of participating in public life. The second step was to steal their assets and take away their citizenship and their rights. The third step was to open an immigration office to get all the Jews out of Germany. And it wasn't until the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 that the decision was made to solve the problem by exterminating all Jews. Now, you may not be aware that Hitler's master plan was largely inspired by US racial segregation practices. The dehumanizing slur Untermenschen, subhuman, came to the Nazis from an American geneticist who sat in on Hitler's sterilization trials. Hitler admired the near genocide of Native Americans and really liked the fact that the survivors had been sent to reservations, concentrated in reservations. And the Nazis borrowed their laws banning marriage and intercourse between Jews and Aryans from the association clause in Texas and North Carolina marriage bans. And all of this plays out in the story of my Berlin-born cousin, Gary Phillips, also known to me as Pips, who's the subject of this book. By 1948, the Iron Curtain had dropped in Hungary. That meant you couldn't travel outside of the Soviet satellite countries, but you could travel within them. So in plotting our escape, my parents packed a suitcase as if we were headed for a vacation in Czechoslovakia. And from there we escaped to France, where we waited 5 years for the papers that would finally allow us to board the Ile-de-France in Le Havre and come to our place of refuge, America. When our ship docked in Manhattan, it was Olga and Pips who were waiting there to meet my parents and me when we arrived in New York as stateless refugees. And that's where my life first intersected with Pips. Pips was born in 1922 to an Aryan mother and a Jewish father. But when he turned 13, he made a fateful decision. The very week that the Nuremberg laws were enacted, he decided to become a bar mitzvah. And those Nuremberg laws, of course, were the laws that would systematically deprive Jews of all their rights. But Pips and his friends weren't yet feeling the impact of the Nuremberg laws. Yes, they had seen brown shirts marching with daggers dangling from their belts, with the torches down Münchnerstrasse, and they'd heard them loudly caroling the Horst Wessel song with its chorus, "When Jewish blood flows from the knife, then it works twice as well." But Pips didn't see this as having anything to do with his family. That only came later. My father was not a lawyer. My father was not a teacher or a college professor. And I think the feelings of youth, whatever you call them, your home hormones are so strong that even these events could not override my optimism, my fun, my ability to learn. Prior to his bar mitzvah, Pips was classified as a Mischling, first grade. Mischling means mongrel. This meant that although he would be deprived of many rights, he wasn't fully considered a Jew, and he was protected from deportation. But he wanted to go through the Jewish ritual for the age of responsibility for two reasons. He wanted to fit in with his friends, who were all Jewish, and he wanted a new bicycle. Now that bicycle was stolen in 3 weeks, but the label Jew was now firmly affixed to his identity in the eyes of the Nazis. But even so, as long as he was living with an Aryan mother, he would be protected from deportation. In school, one boy, at the prodding of his parents, loudly proclaimed himself to be a German nationalist, and on one occasion, unprovoked, the boy stood in front of Phillips, locking eyes with him, and declared, "The God who let iron grow didn't want any Jews." Phillips was dumbfounded. It was so ridiculous. If God didn't want Jews, why did he make them? In another episode, the religion teacher at his school preached that their Jesus had been killed by Jews. Another time, he witnessed a Jewish student being tied to a tree and beaten. But he was not yet a Jew, so he didn't see these things as being connected to him. But the accretion of Phipps's Jewish identity was built through episodes like these. Now Phillips, like so many Germans, was steeped in Teutonic paganism with its Germanic gods Valhalla, Wotan, Thor, Loki. Richard Wagner's opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen, is akin to a national saga. The rituals of the Nazis, the big bonfires, some of which were used to burn books, the martial music, the massive structures, they were all steeped in paganism. But ironically, it wasn't in German schools that Phillips was taught this Teutonic worldview. It was in the Jewish schools that he had to attend after Jews could no longer attend German schools. He said, "I grew up in that atmosphere, and I didn't at first reject it. I felt German, part and parcel of this, until the age of 12. It's not from one day to another that I decided to turn my back on these things. This was a gradual process." He later theorized that one of the many elements that went into the Nazi ideology was a rejection of Christianity and its Jewish roots. So using violence and economic pressure, the goal of the Nazis was to terrorize all Jews into voluntarily leaving Germany. But when they did leave, Jews had to pay a tax equal to 90% of their wealth, and anyone caught transferring assets out of the country was deemed an economic saboteur and subject to a long prison sentence. Jewish stores closed due to lack of customers. Non-Jews stopped socializing with Jews. Jewish businesses were transferred to Aryan ownership at a fraction of their market value. Jews could no longer work in brokerages or stock exchanges. German theaters were closed to them. Jews, now excluded from all the professions, took menial jobs if they could find any work at all. Phipps's father, Ernst, was among them. After Hitler took power, many Aryans wouldn't work with a Jew, leaving Phipps's father with few Gentile customers. He still had some Jewish customers, but in the 1930s, Jews were insecure, and there wasn't much interest in renovating property. So long as Hitler and the Nazis were in power, why would they invest? That just wasn't the time. So they made do with what they had, and Ernst could no longer afford to pay for his son's school, which didn't make any difference because, as I said before, in 1933, Jews had to leave all Aryan schools. Now, bicycles would play an important role in Phipps's life, and Phipps was a very fast cyclist. In 1938, he got a job making deliveries for an electrical appliance store. So he would board his bicycle in the morning, he would report for duty, He rode around dropping off his deliveries, and he did it in good time. I thought they don't expect me to come back for an hour, and it's only 40 minutes, so I might as well goof off for 20 minutes and sit on a park bench, which was not exactly straight, but it was one of my lesser sins. One day, he was making his rounds and came to Fanonenstrasse, the site of a monumental synagogue. The structure made no attempt to cower in the shadows. Its main portal boldly proclaimed itself to be a Jewish house of worship. But in 1931, anti-Semitic gangs attacked the temple, the largest in Berlin, and the Nazis shuttered it for good in 1936. On this day, in 1938, there was a large crowd milling on Fanonenstrasse. Phillips spotted smoke and flames, and he dismounted from his bicycle and ambled into the crowd to see what was going on. As he inched closer, he saw that the synagogue was engulfed in flames. I was terribly upset. Something like that had never happened before, even under the Nazis, and it meant the beginning of the destruction of the Jewish community. Unbeknownst to Phillips, a mile away, the synagogue where he became the bar mitzvah was in ashes. Suddenly a man broke out of the crowd and ran toward Kulflustendam. Dozens of people chased after him, shouting, "A Jew! A Jew! Kill the Jew!" Phillips jumped back on his bicycle and he followed the crowd. There's a subway under the Kulflustendam with vents at street level. The crowd grabbed hold of the hapless Jew, lifted him over the grill, and flung him onto the tracks. A minute later, a train rushed by and ground him to smithereens. Phillips heard the man's screams and the shouts of the crowd. "Ha! Ha! We got him!" To say this shook me up is putting it mildly. This was the first time I saw violence with my own eyes, real violence, not just people being kicked out of their jobs, but real violence, real murder. That left an impression on me that I will never forget. It gave me a foretaste. It's going to get worse. It was the night of November 9th, 1938. Phillips didn't yet know it, but he had just borne witness to Kristallnacht. Jews took the hint and tried to find a country to take them in so that they could leave Germany. Phipps's family didn't succeed, so they stayed put. The strains under which Jews were living took a toll on his parents' marriage, and they divorced. Fearing backlash from Aryans as families were broken up, the Nazi regime didn't deport Jews married to Aryan spouses. Phipps's father no longer had that protection. And after forced labor in a factory, he eventually ended up in Theresienstadt, where he died with 35,440 other Jews. Phillips still had the protection of living with an Aryan parent, but in 1940, at age 18, he fell desperately in love with 16-year-old Ilse Rosenthal, a full Jew. Mass deportations of Jews were about to start, and Jews were no longer allowed to leave Germany. When in 1943, Ilse's family got the summons to appear at Gestapo headquarters, Phillips convinced Ilse to stay with him. Ilse's family was sent to Riga, Latvia, where all were killed, with 25,000 other Jews. They didn't come to pick you up. Jews weren't dragged out of their homes. It shows you how confident the authorities were in people's willingness to go along, to follow orders. Jews got postcards in the mail. Next Tuesday at 7 in the morning, you must report to such and such a place. Bring with you extra food and clothes for 3 days, but no more than you can carry, and you will be evacuated. The word evacuated didn't sound terrible, since a lot of Aryans were evacuated because air raids had already begun. Most Jews accepted that. They couldn't believe what was really happening. The only thing I knew was that I didn't want to live without Ilse. I was too insensitive, too egotistical, too self-involved, and too dumb to understand what it meant when she had to say goodbye to her mother and her brother for the last time. I didn't even make a serious attempt to understand. But Pips also made a sacrifice. He had given up the protection of living with an Aryan parent and became a fugitive to be hunted down and imprisoned. He also gave up all semblance of normal life. Pips would have to protect Ilse. He would have to scavenge for food in the black market. He would have to find places to sleep. To buy groceries in the black market cost a lot of money. I had to make money. How do I make money? In Pips's circle, everyone was looking for a place to hide. No mean feat in the face of the ubiquitous German system of registrations. You had to have a Kent card and a Wehrpass if you were military age. You couldn't be overnight anywhere without being registered with a police precinct. You couldn't go to a hotel even if they had room and you had the money. You couldn't ask anyone to take you in. You were illegal. But that wasn't the only thing. You had to eat. To eat, you had to have ration cards. The cards had to be registered with a local butcher. You couldn't register unless you also showed your ID card with your address. But what if you had to leave your area for other reasons? For that, a Reisepass was needed to travel both within and outside Germany. Now I needed to get traveler's cards, which were very hard to get legally and were very expensive to get illegally. At the end of 42, I managed to get across the border to get a fake non-Jewish Kent-card for Ilse. Now, given that Ilse and Pips were now illegal, they could not risk using their ration cards, nor could they survive on what food the ration cards provided for Jews. But there was more. The air raids increased and altered life in Berlin. It finally came to the point where the British were so reliable, they would come at midnight almost every night, and people scheduled themselves around the air raids. I'll see you a half hour after the all clear. Of course, nobody got much sleep, and it made hiding from the Gestapo that much more difficult. And each building had an air raid warden. The wardens took it as part of their civic duty to snoop on their charges. They missed nothing. Whenever they discovered someone out of the ordinary, they would go to the police and find out if they knew anything about this person. So navigating around air raid wardens narrowed even further the options for finding shelter. So it's in the face of these nearly insurmountable obstacles that Pips and Ilse went into hiding in Berlin in 1943, right under the noses of their oppressors. They succeeded for 3.5 months, until they were accosted by two men flashing IDs in the Alexanderplatz train station. Ilse showed her fake Kent-card, and that was when Pips's life was shattered. They walked us out of the station and into police headquarters. I was in shock and barely able to walk. It was as if I'd been hit in the head by heavy artillery, as if my nervous system circuit breakers had exploded. I couldn't even look at Ilse to gauge her reaction, to see how she felt and to say something in support. If I did look at her, I didn't see her. If she said something to me, I didn't hear it. Maybe I could have tried for a last embrace, but maybe they would have let me kiss her one more time. But then she was led away, and all I could say was, "Wir halten zusammen." We stick together. I knew I would never see her again. This was the girl who was the great love of my life and I of hers, and I collapsed mentally. It was the worst day and the greatest shock of my life. Pips had been certain that if he and Ilse had ever fallen into the clutches of the Gestapo, their lives would be over, and now it had happened. Ilse was gone, and Pips was led to a kind of cage. The tired and disinterested Gestapo officers just asked him routine questions, name, address, which Pips answered mechanically. And in his zombie-like state, Pips later wrote, "I will never recover from this night, this evening, this situation, I will never recover if I live to be 100. Phillips was led down a barely illuminated corridor and shoved into a totally dark room. He had no idea where he was, but he could feel bodies underfoot. He lay down on the floor and strangely fell instantly asleep. The next morning, his jailers opened the door, and Phillips realized he was in a small cell with a dozen people in it. Phillips was led down to the cellar. He wasn't yet capable of orienting himself, but he later divined that there were 3 large cells on the underground, and each cell held hundreds of prisoners. There was no room for anybody to stretch out. Prisoners sat cramped next to each other on the floor. There was one toilet, which was overflowing. One day, the guards opened the door and shoved a large bucket containing a thin soup into the entrance. They handed out a dozen bowls, but no spoons. The prisoners lined up with their bowls, and their bowls were filled with some crap with a few potato peels floating in there. They had to eat that right away because the bowls had to be turned over to the next dozen. And because they had no spoons, it was very hot at the beginning, and they burned their tongues. And by the time they got to the tail end of the line, it was ice cold. This being my first prison, I was stupid. I didn't know how to handle myself. So I usually ended up with the ice cold stuff and not much of it. That's what we got to eat once a day, and nothing else. But Phillips was still too upset, nauseous, and numb to feel hunger. He felt as near death as possible, short of being shot or stabbed. He remained in that dank cell for 10 days. Every morning they opened the door and read out a list of Polish names, Russian names. These people were taken out and you never knew what happened to them. At least once a day we heard salvos in the courtyard above us. We figured that some of these guys were being shot. Even in the most gruesome horror films, you would not see anything like this. And this was real. I don't think I thought much of Ilsa at the time. I was too crushed, too dazed. And I guess I had a strong survival instinct. My nervous system told me what I could and couldn't afford to think about. After 10 days, Phipps's name was called. While he was relieved to get out of his hellhole, he was afraid that he was about to be shot. Instead, he was taken in steel handcuffs to another Gestapo office a few blocks away, unlike the police headquarters he had just left. This was an office that dealt mostly with Jews. A man in civilian clothes sat behind a desk with a secretary seated beside him. He was obviously a low-grade functionary, but he was Gestapo, the deadly enemy, the rattlesnake that would devour me or kill me. I stood there and he bellowed a few questions at me. Then he said, "You're not wearing your Jew star." He ordered his secretary to get one for me, along with a needle and thread. He threw it on the floor and said, "Sew that onto your jacket." I sat down on the floor. I started sewing, which wasn't exactly my cup of tea. While I was doing this, I was vaguely aware that he was kicking me, but I didn't feel the pain. It was only later that I couldn't sit. Phillips finally managed to sew the Jew star on his jacket. Then the interrogation started in earnest. The officer got straight to the point. "What's the name of the girl we arrested?" Thoroughly shaken, Phillips blurted out, "Ilsa Rosenthal." They asked me nothing else about her, only her name. I was totally unprepared for that. I've asked myself, why did I say that? How could I have done this? Did I betray her? I automatically assumed that the minute they got hold of us, we're finished. That was ingrained. 10 days had passed since our arrest. If they wanted to know something about her that they didn't already know, they wouldn't have kept her for 10 days. Phillips later learned that during that 10-day period, Ilsa had been transferred to Groß Hamburger Straße, a smaller Gestapo prison for Jews being shipped to Auschwitz. With all reason, I tell myself that I did not betray her. I wasn't afraid of being beaten and kicked. I had simply taken for granted that she was gone, finished. So when they asked me her name, it couldn't have made any difference. But I still feel I should not have done it, and I still feel guilty about it. After being wrenched away from Pips, Ilse was sent to Auschwitz, where she was killed. Pips's capture with Ilse was the first of 4 arrests and 3 escapes. There were many escapades, both funny and frightening. They're all in here. He could have escaped a 4th time, but realized he had nowhere to go and he decided to stay put. And it's a good thing too, because that prison is where he met Olga Horvath, my cousin, who would become his wife. Olga was born in Dej, a small Transylvanian town, in 1926. She had an idyllic childhood with parents she adored and who adored her in return. Her totally protected childhood was shared with a beloved orphan cousin whom her parents had taken in. Olga started playing the violin at age 6. As she got older, she traveled from Budapest to Berlin for violin lessons. She didn't think that she would have made a good soloist, and she had no interest in playing in an orchestra, but she loved playing chamber music. And so at age 18, she was about to embark on a music career, but she never had a chance to try, because at that age, she was deported to Auschwitz, and she would never pick up a violin again. Olga and her 41-year-old mother were among the first deportees. Olga's father had already died in a forced labor camp in Ukraine. The mother and daughter spent 3 days in a cattle car with no food and water. There was one bucket to use as a toilet in the tightly crammed car. And when the train finally arrived at its destination and its passengers were herded out of the cattle cars, 2 lines were formed. One for men and older boys, one for women and children. During the selections on the train platform, a child was crying for her mother. She had lost her mother. So taking pity, Olga's mother took the girl's hand, and that was her death sentence. Any mother with a child younger than 15 was immediately gassed with her offspring. The SS officer assumed the little girl was hers, and with a flick of a wrist, directed Olga's mother and the unknown child to the gas chamber. That placed them among the 80% of Auschwitz's Hungarian Jews who were murdered upon arrival. In the confusion, Olga lost track of her mother. Panicked, she approached a Polish trustee and implored, "I can't find my mother. Where's my mother?" He replied indifferently, "I don't know, did she have a child with her?" Olga said yes, but it wasn't her child. It makes no difference. You see the smoke coming out of that chimney? That's the crematorium. That's where your mother is. In Auschwitz, all the women had to exit the barracks at 5 o'clock in the morning, summer or winter, completely naked. They lined up to be left standing for hours. Then either the notorious Joseph Mengele or one of his deputies would amble through their ranks to look over the hapless prisoners. Pips said anybody who looked under the weather, women whose breasts were sagging too much, anybody who didn't look quite kosher, anybody who wasn't fit, was taken by truck to the gas chambers. The girls knew where they were going, so they pinched their cheeks to look rosy, but they were young, their breasts weren't sagging, and they were in good shape physically. At that point, the inmates no longer had striped uniforms, just rags. Later, Olga was given a totally threadbare coat with a big red stripe running down the back, and that was actually appropriate for her work assignment, which was Scheißkommando. Every morning, the commando had to empty the buckets from the barracks where inmates had toileted during the night, and with widespread diarrhea, the buckets overflowed. The buckets were carried to the latrine, a 30-foot deep pit with slippery poles to seat as many people as possible. and those who were short had to dangle their legs above the thick brown sea swelling below like a volcano cut short to swallow its own eruption. Eventually, Olga was reassigned to the epidemic hospital. Why the hell would Germans have a hospital in Auschwitz where they're burning 5,000 people a day, wondered Phillips. This was only for transmittable diseases, typhus, dysentery, measles. It was run by a Jewish doctor, except she couldn't do much because she didn't have any medication. People had open sores, bleeding, pus. At best, they found a little piece of paper, and that was the best they could do. Olga became the nurse, which was crazy, because since you couldn't nurse anybody. By December 1944, the Red Army was closing in, and the SS began the final evacuation of the Auschwitz complex. From January 17th to 21st, 1945, 56,000 prisoners were marched under heavy guard from Auschwitz and its subcamps to camps inside Germany. Olga was in a group of about 1,000, mostly young women, who were sent on the death march from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. Having become separate from her group, she ended up in the Berlin prison, where Phillips had spent the better part of 2 years. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, and that prison morphed into a displaced persons camp. After spending 2 more years in the chaos of post-war Berlin, Hayes finally arranged for Olga and Phillips's resettlement in New York. After sailing out of Antwerp, the Marine Flasher took 2 weeks to arrive in New York. As it came through the Verrazano Narrows, the Statue of Liberty came into view. It was smaller than Phillips expected, but because the Marine Flasher dropped anchor overnight in the Narrows, he had plenty of time to contemplate this icon of welcome and freedom. The ship left Europe in bitter cold, and it arrived in America in bitter cold. But Phillips still went to the top deck to get his first glimpse of New York. Ahead of him were well-lit skyscrapers. To his left was Lady Liberty. To his right was the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Phillips was mesmerized by the glimmer of white headlights and red rear lights as the cars whizzed by in the night. He'd never seen so many cars, nor had he ever owned or driven one. But that would change in the US, where driving became an abiding passion. The trajectory of his progress up the ladder of the American dream would be marked by the successive cars he owned, as well as the residences in which he lived. When morning came, the Marine Flasher was tugged into port on the west side of Manhattan. The passengers were ordered to disembark. Olga and Phillips didn't have much luggage, just a trunk which had been gifted to them before they left Berlin. A social worker from Hayes approached to take charge of the newly arrived DPs. The social worker took Olga and Phillips in a taxi to Hayes headquarters on Lafayette Street in the Village. That building would later house Joseph Papp's renowned public theater, where so many Broadway hits were spawned. But in 1947, it was a shelter for newly arrived Jews. On the way to Greenwich Village, the taxi passed through Times Square. I couldn't believe it. Such a place like that, lights all over. There was one sign, a block long, for Camel cigarettes. A man's face with an open mouth. Every second, a puff of smoke came out of his mouth. The eighth wonder of the world. We couldn't believe that we weren't dreaming. But there was also shock and disappointment. Even though we had always known it was unrealistic, we had visions of New York, particularly Broadway, as nothing but tuxedos, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, and everybody dressed up. There was a movie series called Broadway Melody of 1936, of 1938, 1940. We had seen at least one of these Broadway melodies, and of course it was all bullshit. We knew it couldn't possibly be that people spent their time waltzing along Broadway, but somehow this had stuck in our heads. Now we see crummy little buildings, filth, paper. We had come from Berlin, which was not exactly a city in full bloom, but that was war. Those were honest to goodness ruins. We were used to them, but New York, the shining city on the hill, looked so dirty. Friends from Berlin came to the highest shelter and took them to Radio City Music Hall. I'd never seen something like this. The ninth wonder of the world. It was a gigantic place, and I still remember the movie I saw in 1947, The Late George Apley. I couldn't understand why this guy was late. I didn't know that late also means dead. Olga and Pips remained at the highest shelter for 3 weeks. A caseworker helped them find an apartment, a 5th floor, walk up in the Bronx, and from there it was a slow but steady climb up the ladder of the American dream. Pip started out as a bicycle messenger and waiter, and later came to co-own the largest photo agency in the world. His work had him hobnobbing with many of the Hollywood luminaries and celebrity editors of the day. Lots of bold-faced names in here. And he became a kind of surrogate father to me. My own father died only 8 months after we arrived in New York, and my mother was left a 36-year-old widow in a strange country with no support network. And I, after all my displacement and trauma, was a rather sad child. So Pips was very important to me. With funny hats, a macabre ability to wiggle his ears, and the weird facial contortions he produced, he was huge fun. I desperately wanted to have more playtime with him. In fact, I once dreamed of scotch taping Olga to the wall so that I could have him for myself. As I grew older, he retained bragging rights over everything I achieved, and he was always the stand-in for the father I had lost. He was there for Soft Father's Weekend in Vassar, my Vassar alums here. He walked me down the aisle and gave me away when my late husband Mark and I were married, and for years after he would ask me, "Do you remember what you said to me right before we started down the aisle?" "Sure," I said, "I need to pee." He and Olga were the first ones to hold my son, Joshua Mark, at his birth, because Joshua's father had died 7 weeks before, and he never met his son. But Pips became a virtual grandfather. His notorious sense of humor and his outrageous inappropriateness stayed with him until the end. He shamelessly flirted with his nurses in the palliative care unit at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And only a few hours before he died, he confided to one of his last visitors, "I have a deal with the guy upstairs. I don't bother him, and he doesn't bother me." Pips was a rascal. In one of the many missives I received from him with instructions for his death, he told me, that of course would be my phone, speaker's phone, right? In instructions for his death, he told me to take care of Olga. "I ain't no angel, at least yet," he said, but he was concerned about Olga's lack of financial know-how, so he instructed me, "Please take care of my affairs." My son. I mean the financial ones when the time comes. With Pips's death, all that remained of this couple is the extraordinary story that Pips left behind. It was a story that he told to anyone who would listen, and now, as a 79-year-old woman, I want to give Pips his due and share his story. In his will, Pips left me his apartment and its contents. The most precious item in this inheritance is the Jew star he refused to wear but was eventually forced to wear. He tried trading the Jew star for chocolates after liberation, and fortunately he didn't succeed. That Jew star sits framed in the center of a ledge in my study. Having devoted more than 3 decades of my life to conflict resolution and advancing interreligious understanding, that Jew star is my lodestar, which reminds me every day of why I do what I do. And as witnesses to the Holocaust die and Holocaust deniers ascend, such stories need to be told. 80 years after the fact, the public seems to have an insatiable appetite for such stories, and best-selling author Dara Horn helps explain why. People love dead Jews. Phillips is one such dead Jew, but with a unique, life-affirming story to tell. But this is also a cautionary tale, and I think Pastor Herr explained this in his introduction. It's a cautionary tale about how authoritarianism can creep up on us and the perils of being in denial as it unfolds. It's also a case study in the inexorable link between dehumanization through hate speech to genocide. Finally, it's a story about identity and the price that one pays for holding on to it. Very little has been written about those who the Nazis classified as Mischlings, especially those who identified as Jewish. Phillips' story is unique because he was a voluntary Jew. He could have been spared much of what he suffered. And unlike most Berlin Jews, he went into hiding. He was arrested 4 times and escaped 3 times. As Dee Dee said in her introduction, he was persecuted by the Nazis, but on several occasions, they also saved his life. So I'll close with what Phillips said. The disappearance of the Jews would mean my death too. Not that I consider myself a perfect Jew. I'm a Jew boy courtesy of Adolf Hitler, but it's my identity. And I feel every human being needs an identity beyond just being a human being. That identity is the one thing that makes me feel as if I'm leaving a legacy. This story is his legacy. Thank you.
Questions? Georgette?
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Fire away.
Charlie.
What would he say to Stephen Miller today?
What would he say to Stephen Miller as a Jew or Stephen Miller as a human being?
Both.
I'm not sure what he would say. I'll tell you what I say. That Stephen Miller represents neither the values of Jesus Christ nor the values of Judaism. There are 40 references in the Hebrew scriptures to caring for the stranger. There's only one reference to love thy neighbor as thyself. That's because it's very easy to love somebody who's like yourself. It's much harder to love the stranger.
Georgette, can you talk a little bit about inherited trauma? This is something that Mary and I have talked about a lot, and what I have seen among my friends who are Holocaust survivors and their children and so forth.
Yes. There's been a lot of research done on second-generation effects of the Holocaust. There is a syndrome that has been identified. I'll summarize it in a very non-scholarly way. What I have said to my son, and I have a feeling that call he was just making was to tell me that his wife just went into labor. But I said to him, Grandma was a very damaged person, because I'm quite sure my mother suffered from PTSD from her Holocaust experiences. I'm less damaged than Grandma, and you're less damaged than me. And I think that's a very maybe crude way to describe intergenerational trauma, but it's certainly there. You know, just speaking personally as a child of the Holocaust, rather than speaking as a scholar, I'm certainly aware that I live in a state of hypervigilance, looking for signals, trying to be sure that I'll know when to run if I have to run. Second generation effects also include overachievement, because children of Holocaust survivors feel that they have to compensate for what their parents went through. In a way, live the lives that their parents were deprived of. Now, when I say deprived of, I don't mean that they necessarily died, but my mother, for example, was a hugely talented person. She was the valedictorian of her class. She had a magnificent singing voice. She was highly cultured, well educated, but her life was a thwarted life. She couldn't realize her ambitions because of what had been done to her. So there is this need to overachieve. There is a great deal of anxiety. Parents who are survivors of the Holocaust tend to be very anxious for their children. I mean, my mother was always very anxious for me if I went out, hung out with my friends, just did the normal things that American kids do. And of course, that anxiety gets transmitted to children. So that's some of the effects of inherited trauma.
Well, you lived through, number one, this was a fabulous presentation, and you really brought his story alive. But what I'm wondering about, you lived through it on some level, but what about educating the next generation and the next generation? So as an example, we lost our son on 9/11. Now I have two daughter-in-laws that didn't know our son. Now I have two grandchildren that are going to learn about 9/11 in an academic way in a classroom.
Yes. Well, in terms of education about the Holocaust and other genocides and regicides, my book immediately before this book was a book called Regicide. Education is very uneven. You know, in Germany, for example, Germany is the only country in Europe that has confronted its past. I have to say that as a Jew, I am much more comfortable in Germany than I am in many other countries in Europe. Some states in the US, you have to teach about the Holocaust. Others, I don't know what's going to happen now that, you can't teach anything that makes people feel uncomfortable or guilty in any way. So I don't know what that's going to mean for Holocaust education or for any kind of education. There are wonderful programs like Facing History and Ourselves, which do a superb job of teaching the Holocaust. But I do think it's very important to not look at the Holocaust as the core of Jewish identity. The Holocaust is something terrible that happened to Jews for no other reason than they were a convenient scapegoat for Germany's defeat in World War I, and Jews always make for a convenient scapegoat. But it's such, I'm going to just digress for a second. It's just so ironic, you know, the meaning of the word scapegoat. It's become so perverted. What it refers to is during Yom Kippur, which is the highest of the Jewish high holy days, part of the custom in ancient times was that a goat would be sent out to carry away the sins of the people, because it's the Day of Atonement. It was a holy act. That's what the scapegoat was. But look what the scapegoat has become. Look what happens with language. So it's something terrible that happened, but that is not the focus of Judaism. And victimization is not the focus of Judaism. You know, my Judaism is a very outward-facing kind of Judaism. And I think what Jews have to think of is their contributions to civilization. And I'm not talking about all the Nobel Prizes, you know, this is a cliche already. You hear about the disproportionate number of Nobel Prizes Jews win. Yeah, they do.
It's true.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about in terms of contributions to civilization. I'm talking about, for example, the notion that began in Judaism that all human beings are made in the sacred image of God and therefore worthy of infinite dignity and respect. That is the foundation of all human rights. That's where it comes from. That's an enormous contribution to civilization. Judaism was the first religion that banned human sacrifice. That is a contribution to civilization, the respect for the human being. And I could go on and on and on, but you're not here to hear a sermon about Judaism.
Preach it.
But I do think it's a very important thing to say, that the Holocaust should not be the defining feature of Judaism. It is not. It's something that happened to us. It is not what we are.
I can't help but think of this structure of the Nazis is very similar to our Jim Crow laws.
Yes, totally. They used Jim Crow laws in America for their own plans.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. No, it's totally based on Jim Crow. Hitler studied very carefully what was going on here in the US. And he adopted it and adapted it.
Sounds very familiar.
So what does that say about us?
Georgette, really appreciate your talk in so many ways. I think visited Auschwitz, it's unspeakable, the horror that people experience there. You know, people talk about this parallelism of what's going on in our country now that seems to be similar, and
Please.
Take the mic.
Do it.
Oh. Well, just was commenting on how, having visited Auschwitz, Kim and I were in Europe living there, we had friends who survived the Holocaust as well. And, you know, it just makes you want to weep to think about what people endured at the hands of Christians, see. So when we see some of the parallelism that people are talking about today in our country, my son, you know, my children, they're a little more they're like, Dad, we got to do something, you know. And I'm like, well, what are we gonna do? You know, we can't resort to violence. That's wrong, morally, ethically for me. But there's a gap between what happened and what looked like it was happening. If they didn't know what was happening to what was happening, and I just assume we're not going to go there, right? So how do you recommend that people of good faith, you know, people who are trying to do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God that we were talking about today, you know, how do you make sure that the powers and principalities don't repeat that here? Because some people think that's entirely possible. I'm not naive enough to think that it's not, but it doesn't compute for me, right? I can't imagine that. This is the United States where we stand for, I've been talking about moral injury, that every day it feels like that's not the way it's supposed to be. You see, stuff that's happening, it's just not right. So anyway, can you help us figure out how do we not get there? Yeah.
Oh, is that all?
Just tidy that up for us.
So, I would approach this in a couple of ways. Number one, you heard me make reference to apocalyptic thinking earlier in my talk. I think this is really, really important. And I think clergy has a very important role here. Because when we fall into the trap of believing that we have a monopoly on truth, that then divides the world into the children of light and the children of darkness. And that then leads to dehumanization. So it's very, very important to, number one, allow for other people's truths, which is different from just pure relativism, but acknowledging that there are many paths to get to one place. Because apocalyptic thinking is very, very dangerous, because it almost inevitably leads to violence. As does binary thinking. As just using an example, the protests on college campuses were a perfect example of binary thinking. You have to be either pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, as if they were mutually exclusive. They're not. You can be both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. It's called being pro-humanity. And once you recognize that this is a false dichotomy that only forces people into corners that they cannot get out of, where you subject them to purity tests, because God forbid you see any kernel of truth or anything worthwhile in the other person or the other party, and suddenly you're a pariah within your own. That too is dangerous thinking, because it makes it impossible to listen. It makes it impossible to communicate. It makes it impossible to do anything but scream at each other. The third thing that I would say is that there's been research done at the University of Virginia, very important research, on hate speech, on weaponized language as a precursor, as a predictor of violence. It's very important to intervene at that point before the violence happens with counter messaging and using very sophisticated communication techniques to do that. And then finally, I would say, in terms of the importance of listening, behind hate, there's often a lot of fear. And it's very important to do deep listening, to understand the fear that's behind the hate, and to address the fear. The late great theologian, Krister Stendahl, who was dean of the Harvard Divinity School, and before that he was the bishop of the Lutheran Church in Sweden, he said something that is always in my mind. He said, "How can you love me if you don't know what hurts me?" It's absolutely profound. Has anybody ever asked you what hurts you? Nobody's asked me what hurts me. Imagine if somebody said, "Tell me, what hurts you. That's the beginning of listening, and that's the beginning of building trust.
Thank you so much. What an honor it is to have you here. Buy the books. We'll have more if we need them. If they're books back there for sale.
I'll be happy to sign them or someone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
We always try to give a blessing, Georgette, to our guest speakers, and you know, you really blessed us. I'll never forget Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem. You get to the end, and there's this quote that I'll just never forget. You know, to forget is the way of destruction. To remember is the way of salvation. And I feel like you're helping us to remember and to avoid, in some small way anyway, destruction. So thank you for helping us. Let's just ask God's blessing on Georgette. And thank you, God, for this time together. Thank you for wisdom spoken from the heart. Thank you for stories that bring alive the history that is so powerful and that we need to continually learn from and pass on from generation to generation. We ask your rich blessing on Georgette and her family and success of her books, her teaching. Give us all peace as we go from this place and strengthen us to be more faithful in our pursuit of doing justice and loving kindness and walking humbly with you. In your most holy name we pray.